In 1872, Mary Todd Lincoln sat for a photograph in a Boston studio. When the image developed, there was someone else in the frame. A faint figure, hands on her shoulders. The face? Abraham Lincoln. Her husband, dead for 7 years. She believed it was real. So did millions of others. Because in the 19th century, especially between the 1850s and early 1900s, ghosts weren't just stories. They were a part of science. This was a time when spirit mediums were household names, when seances were considered respectable, when the boundary between death and life felt thinner than ever. This is the story of the forgotten ghost boom, the lost century of ghosts. On March 31st, 1848, in the small village of Hydesville, New York, two teenage sisters, Margaret and Kate Fox, claimed they could hear knocking sounds in their bedroom. When they snapped their fingers, the knocks responded. When they asked questions, the knocks answered. Once for yes, twice for no. The sisters said the noises were coming from a spirit, a murdered man buried in the basement. Within weeks, word spread across Western New York. Neighbors gathered in the Fox home to witness the strange events. And by that summer, the girls were performing public demonstrations to packed halls across the Northeast. Little did anyone know, this was the birth of modern spiritualism. The Fox sisters became national celebrities, not entertainers, but mediums. They insisted they weren't performing tricks, they were facilitating conversations with the dead. By 1850, spiritualist newspapers were circulating nationwide. Public seances were being held in cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. In England, the movement took hold just as quickly, fueled by figures like Daniel Douglas Home, a Scottish medium who performed for royalty and was said to levitate during seances. But this was more than entertainment. By the 1860s, the American Civil War had ended the lives of over 600,000 people. In England, cholera and typhoid fever claimed tens of thousands each year. For grieving families, seances offered something no minister, doctor, or undertaker could: a way to contact the dead. In 1861, a man named William H. Mumler, a Boston engraver and amateur photographer, developed a self-portrait that changed his life. Standing behind him in the photo was a faint, translucent figure, a young girl. He swore it wasn't a trick. Soon, others came to his studio asking for portraits. And in photo after photo, spirits began to appear. By 1863, spirit photography had become a phenomenon. Widows, mothers, children, all lining up to be photographed with lost loved ones. Many believed the ghosts in the images were real. One of his most famous clients, Mary Todd Lincoln, who visited Mumler in disguise and received an image showing the spirit of her late husband. But skeptics pushed back. In 1869, Mumler was put on trial for fraud in New York City. One of the prosecution's witnesses was P.T. Barnum, who testified that the photos were nothing more than trickery and exploitation of the grieving. Mumler was acquitted, but his reputation never recovered. He died in poverty in 1884. Still, the desire to use technology to reach the dead didn't fade. Inventors created devices like spirit trumpets, planchettes, and even early telegraph-style machines meant to capture ghostly messages. Seance rooms began to look less like churches and more like laboratories. And one of those labs belonged to Thomas Edison. In the 1920s, the inventor of the phonograph gave a series of interviews claiming he was working on something new, a device to contact the dead. He called it the spirit phone, a machine so sensitive it could detect voices from the beyond. Unlike mediums or seances, Edison believed that real communication with the dead would come through wires and circuits, not candlelight and chance. He never finished it. Some say it was a hoax. Others believe the plans were lost or buried. By the late 1800s, seances weren't just quiet gatherings. They were full-blown performances. Mediums would dim the gaslights, darken the parlor, guide their guests into silence, and then the manifestations would begin. The air would chill, tables tipped, bells rang without being touched, disembodied voices echoed from floating trumpets. But seances weren't just spooky, they were social. This was a time when people attended a seance the way we might go to a dinner party, with rules, etiquette, and even refreshments. Some circles believed that spirits kept business hours, only arriving after dark, and only on certain days of the week. Many banned the newly bereaved, fearing their grief might invite dangerous spirits. Others didn't allow crossing your legs because it could tangle the energy. Mediums sometimes claimed the spirits needed food and would leave out cakes, wine, or sugar cubes, which were said to be disturbed by the end of the night. The ghosts had names, identities, backstories. Some, like Katie King, even materialized in full form, walking the room, speaking to guests, and allegedly having a pulse. Seances had become immersive theater, but to many, it was much more than that. It was a sacred act, a way to reach across a veil, which death had drawn far too quickly. But then, things got stranger. Ectoplasm. The term was first coined in 1894 by Charles Richet, a French physiologist and Nobel Prize winner. He described it as a mysterious living substance that mediums could exude from their bodies. Photos from this era show it oozing from mouths, noses, ears, sometimes taking the form of faces, hands, or entire ghostly figures. The most famous ectoplasm medium, Ava Carrière, also known as Ava C. In a series of seances between 1909 and 1914, she produced bizarre materializations, including phantom faces made of gauze and magazine clippings, all under the supervision of researchers. Another was Mina Crandon, better known as Marjorie, who performed for elite audiences in Boston during the 1920s. She claimed to channel her dead brother Walter and produced ectoplasm that pulsed and moved during seances. Photographs of these sessions survive, and they're some of the strangest images ever taken. But cracks began to show. In one session, an investigator found out that the ectoplasm was actually a cutout from a lady's home journal. In another, researchers discovered string and muslin hidden under the seance table. And yet, even when the fraud was exposed, the belief persisted, because many weren't just looking for proof, they were simply looking for comfort. The 19th century wasn't just the golden age of ghosts, it was the golden age of grief, and in many ways, it was a trend, one that began with the Queen of England. In December of 1861, Prince Albert, husband of Queen Victoria, died suddenly of typhoid fever. Victoria was devastated. She withdrew from public life. She wore black every day for the remaining 40 years of her reign. She commissioned portraits of Albert, kept his room preserved, and even had his clothes laid out for decades, as if he might return. But what started as personal mourning became public expectation. Across the British Empire, and soon across America, mourning became a lifestyle. Black clothing, black envelopes, black jewelry. Entire industries formed around death, and an entire etiquette system arose to govern it. If your husband died, you wore black for 2 years. If your child died, 6 months. Mourning jewelry was made from human hair, woven into brooches, rings, lockets, and worn close to the heart. And when someone died, families didn't just bury them. They posed them, photographed them, smiled next to them, and sometimes took one last portrait. These were called memento mori, images of the dead, often posed to appear alive. Children were made to sit up, eyes were painted onto closed eyelids. Dead wives were posed with their husbands, sometimes standing. To us, it feels morbid, but to the Victorians, it was an act of love. Grief documented, memory materialized. And into this culture of ritualized grief came the ghost. Because when your entire world revolved around remembering the dead, why not try to reach them? In 1882, a group of scholars, philosophers, and scientists met in London to find something new: the Society of Psychical Research. Its mission was radical, but not ridiculous. They didn't claim ghosts were real. They simply wanted to study them.
A psychical research is a science. Its object is to ascertain by exact experimental methods how far the alleged phenomena of the seance room can be brought into line with normality.
The SPR set out to investigate telepathy, apparitions, automatic writing, hauntings, and mediumship using the tools of science. And it wasn't fringe science. Its members included leading figures like Frederick W.H. Myers, a classicist and psychologist, William James, founder of American psychology, even Arthur Balfour, who would go on to become prime minister. They collected case files, interviewed witnesses, attended seances, published reports, and some of them, to their surprise, started to believe. One study cataloged hundreds of people who claimed to have seen a loved one's ghost within hours of that person's death. Another analyzed reports of shared dreams and verified apparitions. They even created a database of sightings that predated death notifications, suggesting in some cases that the living sensed the dead before knowing they were even gone. The SPR never claimed to find absolute proof, but what they did find was harder to dismiss: patterns, consistency, and moments that defied explanation. For decades, mediums had the public's attention. They spoke to the dead, They produced voices, knocks, even ectoplasm. And many people, grieving, searching, believed them, but not everyone did. By the early 1900s, a new wave of skeptics began pushing back, not scientists, magicians. Because magicians knew something others didn't, how the trick was done. The most famous of them all was Harry Houdini. He'd escaped from jails, safes, even underwater coffins. But his final act? Exposing fraudulent mediums. Houdini had once wanted to believe. After his mother's death, he attended seances in secret, hoping for a real connection. But all he saw was deception. Hidden assistants, false floors, muslin passed off as spirit matter. He recognized the moves because they were his. He began staging live demonstrations of how mediums faked their powers. He testified before Congress. He published exposés, and one by one, famous mediums fell. But the attacks weren't just technical, they were emotional. People weren't just being lied to, they were being exploited. Houdini's crusade helped turn the tide. Seances went from spiritual to suspicious. And by the 1930s, the ghost boom was fading. And even as the curtain fell, one thing remained: the need to believe. By the mid-20th century, the golden age of ghosts was over. Mediums fell out of fashion. Seances became punchlines. Spirit photography was archived as novelty. But what if something real got buried along with the fraud? Because in the strange overlap between science, grief, and spectacle, people were asking serious questions. What happens when we die? Where does the mind go? Is consciousness something more than biology? For a brief moment in history, we tried to answer those questions. With typewriters and trumpets, with tears. The spiritualist movement wasn't just about ghosts. It was about memory, longing, and the hope that love might survive death. Today, most people don't hold seances in their parlors. We scroll, we stream, we joke about ghosts, but barely reach for them. And yet, the questions remain. Because maybe we weren't wrong to look for something. Maybe we were just looking with the wrong tools. For nearly 100 years, we tried to speak to the dead. Not in whispers, but with cameras, with notebooks, with rituals passed from parlors to laboratories. Now, the photographs are filed away. The journals are faded. The ghosts have gone quiet. But they haven't vanished. Because whether we call it science, memory, or superstition, the search hasn't ended. And maybe it never will.